Okay. Before we get started, how's everyone doing? Any questions, any issues, things you've run up against already? What you'd like to talk about? Also, when you talk, please take off your mask. I'm old, I'm a little hard of hearing. I can't see your lips and your muzzle. It's very hard to understand. Apparently everything's going fine. No questions, no issues. I did finally, I'm sorry I was late posting the video from last week. I just posted it this morning. I'll get this next one. Oh, it is recording. Did I press the button to record? Apparently I did. I have not yet looked at your wiki pages to look over your org charts and status reports. I will do this week, and I will GM, whoever has been designated on each team as project manager, if I have any questions or issues. We'll go over them a little bit more next week, because we'll also look at your requirements as well. No questions. Everyone's ready to launch in. Let's see. The Peopleware exam is already up there. And it's set so that you can go back, you can save and go back and then go back. So you can go look at the questions there and use those as you go through your reading in Peopleware. So when you see stuff, you can go, go on to Learning Suite, type it in. I will try to get all of the Webster quizzes finished this week. And I'll get the facts and fallacies quiz done probably in another week or two. So you should be in pretty good shape. All your assignments that actually where you have to do an online quiz. And then you folks will probably be better prepared for the midterm than anyone, because in all the past semesters, all you did was check off and say, yes, I read it. And as I said at the start of the class, the start of the semester, I've had students consistently say, could you do something to sort of prepare us better for the midterm? And some of them suggested, can you have questions like the midterm, which is literally what you've got there. The first question for Mythical Man Month was straight out of the first day's lecture. The second question, the one that's up there for Peopleware, was literally a question on last semester's midterm. So as you get familiar with this, you guys are probably going to break the average for the grade on midterm, which is pretty high. Yeah, but the department still likes me. Okay, I think they're willing to leave me alone for now. Okay, Peopleware. Fred Brooks mentioned Peopleware in the one of his later chapters in his anniversary edition of Mythical Man Month. This is probably, I'll say, the second most influential, after Brooks' Mythical Man Month, second most influential book. And like Mythical Man Month, everyone's heard of it, and very few people have read it, and no one seems to believe, especially the managers. The general theme, the style, the big thing with Mythical Man Month, Fred Brooks is very concise. He says a lot with a short amount, and he builds stuff up. DeMarco and Lister sort of go all over the place. You've probably seen that already reading these first 6 chapters. Like, we're talking about this, we're going to talk about this totally different thing here, but it's somehow related. We're going to go back to this. A lot of anecdotes. But the nice thing, their first edition, I want to say it's 1989. So that's well over 30 years ago. And yet, like Mythical Man Month, it's just as relevant. And sadly, all the problems they identify are still pervasive in the industry. So as you read this book, you'll see some data, technical references, and so on, but trust me, when you get out in the industry, you'll say, oh my gosh, we read about this in 428. Okay, somewhere today, a project is failing. DeMarco and Lister spent many, many years going into corporations and trying to improve their software development process in-house, and to help them to salvage or rescue failing projects, something I've done as well. this is a key point. It was almost never a technological issue. It was almost always a sociological issue. And the third point here says most managers are willing to admit, yeah, it's really people issues, but they're not willing to manage that way. What you'll find as you get out in industry is the focus is going to be, we've got the right methodology, we've got the right tools, you know, we're doing DevOps, we're doing CI/CD, we've got integrated testing, you know, we're using this nifty new language, we've got this, you know, great library, and so on and so forth. And those are all good. You guys are using the best tools that have ever existed in the history of software development. Take it from someone who started off with punched cards. You guys are living in paradise as far as tools go. You really are. But it's not the tools that cause the project failures. It is the human issues. How many of you in your internships and or jobs have seen issues that have delayed or even caused projects to fail, and it's been very clear that this isn't because you're not using the right language or methodology, it's because of one or more of the people involved. Often it's just one, but sometimes it's multiple people. How many of you have seen this? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone have tales they want to tell out of school? Yes.
Yeah, basically there was just one guy on the team, like we'd give him like maybe 2 or 3 things to do, the rest of us had like 10 or 12. And, oh, I'm sorry. And he just never did it. And we'd ask him what the issue was, and he's like, oh, it's just a really difficult problem, and you know, one of us would go in there and we'd figure it out in a couple hours. And I don't know, it was just so interesting to me because I remember when he was interviewed, I was very impressed with how sharp he was. Mm-hmm. But then for some reason when he went to work, that disappeared.
This is, and thank you for saying that, because this is one of the most difficult problems in the industry today. There are developers who are frankly unqualified, but who give great interviews. And they get hired. And then they don't do anything. Or other people have to pick up the slack for them. This goes all the way back. When you read in Tempest, my experience here as an undergrad 40 plus years ago, with the teacher for 404, the co-teacher who was from industry, saying if you knew which ones to pick, you could take half of all the people out there working in software development, take them outside and shoot them, and not only would no deadlines be missed, a lot of them would be advanced. And I remember hearing that in class and thinking, oh my gosh, that's cold. And then I graduated and started working at General Dynamics. I said, oh my gosh, he's right. Yes?
Is that because the skill of like mastery over tier 0 and maybe tier 1 ignorance is different from, it seems like most employment development where we don't already have a solution tends to be more in the tier 2 of ignorance, and having the skill of chipping away at the tier 2 is different from mastery over tier 0 and tier 1.
Yes. Remember what I said the first day of class. This was an insight that I gained off of Quora, of all places, and just within the last year or two. Someone was commenting on an answer I had given, and he said, I've decided that software development is more like research than engineering. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's exactly right. And that's the problem. If you're not a good researcher, if you're not the one who can sit and think through problems and say, what are all the possibilities? What do I have to do? What are the problems that are going to come up ahead of time? You can be good at coding, say, yeah, I know how to do this and I know how to do that. There's actually a great, often what you end up with is something, and let me go grab this because I just posted this. You'll hear me talk a lot about my daughter Crystal, who's a software engineer. She graduated from the U, but I don't hold that against her. And I just posted this on her page because we always share programming. Why did it just go away? Come on, stop going on this one. Chris here.
If you're trying to show us something, it's not changing that thought, just so you know.
Oh, that's right. Hang on a second. Let me I've got to actually shut down the slide presentation. Come on. There you go. That's my dark crystal. Faithful dog boy. This. And this is how a lot of those people program. It's all from the internet, and it's kind of like copy and paste and go hit. Stack Overflow. Thank you. You have to stop and think about that for a second. The problem is they may be really, I won't even say really good, they may be okay at getting template solutions and so on, but when you get into that second level of ignorance, not knowing what you don't know, and you're basically thrashing around and trying to figure out things, the more experience you have and the more background you have, and this is why, one of the common, I keep interrupting myself, one of the common questions that comes up on Quora is, what one programming language can I learn so I'm making a six-figure salary in 6 months? And those of us who work in the industry just sort of laugh and say, no, that's not how it works. It's not what programming language you use. It's whether or not you're good at software engineering. And the advantage you have by having a CS degree, and the reason why a lot of companies won't even look at you unless you've just got this golden resume. I mean, I've hired people who have CS degrees because they had great work experience and they came highly recommended. But if I'm just looking at a blind resume and someone says, yeah, I went to a boot camp for Python, it's like, pass. Unless I really want a real junior entry-level person who, we can grow and develop and so on. But usually, when I've been hiring, that's not the type of people I'm looking for. You want people who can bring a lot of different concepts to bear. When I was at Monitor Labs, we were doing, Monitor Labs built data acquisition devices. These were boxes that would sit like at smokestacks at factories and have sensors. And they would sense for certain chemicals, and then they would transmit back to a central location what the emissions levels were. We were developing a whole new line of them, Tabasco line of these data acquisition devices. It's going to be an embedded 6502 processor. It was me and one developer, Guy Grotke, who were going to basically design the software from the ground up. We had the hardware specs, and we basically had a bare bones 6502 with a certain amount of ROM, a certain amount of RAM. And the first thing I did was I spent 3 weeks in my office with my feet up on my desk staring at the ceiling. I was trying to think through, I'd been there for, I've been there probably for about 6 months. I've done bug fixes on some of their existing devices, which used more primitive processors, Fairchild F8, so on and so forth. I knew the concepts, I knew the business and so on, but I was trying to think of everything that we were going to have to do in this box and build from scratch. And spent 3 weeks staring and literally for 8 hours a day for 3 weeks, trying to think through all the things that could go wrong, basically back to the path diagram, trying to climb up the mountains that you saw in Armor. And trying to think through that, occasionally talking to some of the engineers and saying, what about this, bouncing some stuff off the guy. And then after 3 weeks of doing nothing but thinking, sat down and started sketching out the architecture and the design we're going to do. And, worked closely with Guy on this. We did it forth because we're in a very tight space, and it became very extensible and very compact. But the point is that, and this is far afield somewhere, but the single biggest factor of the people and the quality of people you have, I said that day one. If you have good software engineers, the methodology and the tools don't matter. They can and will produce. Which is why you always hire for talent and experience first. Okay. This is, Management tends to see development as like making fast food. It's like, well, you did this one app, can't you just crank out the next one? It's an industrial mindset. One of the extra credit readings you have is The Longest Yard, which is an article Ruby Raley and I co-authored and published in Cutter IT Journal. It's in the reading section, or no, it's in the extra credit section. No, it's in the reading section. It's like Webster 7 or Webster 8 or something. But what we specifically address there is putting together an effective software development team is far more like building a sports team than having, you know, manufacturers on an assembly line. Management sees people as interchangeable. Oh, we lost this developer. Yes, she was the chief architect, and yes, she was absolutely brilliant, but we'll just hire this entry-level person out of college, and he'll do just as well. Too many managers see us as interchangeable. They see us as manufacturers on an assembly line and not craftspeople. And to our credit. To our, yes, detriment. As they say, the average software development doesn't own a single book on the subject of his or her work and hasn't even read one. This is why I force you to read these books. That's why I told you day one. When you get out there, you'll find most of the people you work around will have probably heard of the books, and almost nobody you work with will have actually read them and understood them. You'll come out of here having read them, having understood them, and recognizing the scenarios around them that they describe. Any thoughts, comments? Yes?
So like how do you,
Massive.
so how do you like communicate that?
Eric, where I think I already told you this. By the way, this is my obligatory apology. I've thought of making little cards for all my stories, and just when I tell a story, putting the card aside so I never tell it again. Except some of the stories are applicable in multiple situations. But at Eric, they had this, I was brought in first because they were trying to transition object technology and they were failing. Then, and this is one where I think I already told you that they had no architectural diagram. But there were also some of the classic problems in mythical amendments. So I went to the head of the division and said, you know, do I have your authorization and a budget to buy everyone here a copy of Mythical Amendment by Fred Brooks, because I think it's critical. And he thought, yes, that's a great idea. So ordered 30 copies, handed them out from the vice president over the division, all the way down, all the management, all the developers, and so on. About 4 to 6 weeks later, I went around and I could not find a single person who had read the book. And yet these were the key issues that were there. So part of the problem you're going to face is that people will have heard of it, but, and we'll get back to the Machiavelli quote, which I think, did I quote Machiavelli? First day here? Yeah. Trying to institute a new order of things, you have the hostility of those who will look bad as a result, and only the lukewarm support of those who stand to gain from it, because they really don't believe it until they've seen it in action. This is a problem you're facing. And we will talk in later classes about ways of trying to change, introduce ideas and get them propagated within your organization. Any other questions, comments, observations, bad experiences? I'm always looking for bad experiences. So keep that in mind. Deanna waits for you, quoting Billy Joel. Management will often want you to work long hours. It's the heroic model of software engineering. It's been around for a long time. The first I really recall encountering it is in the early days when the Macintosh was still under development at Apple as sort of a pirate project being headed up by Steve Jobs and who really only had the authority to do it because he was one of the founders of Apple. But word came out that the developers there had T-shirts that said working 90 hours a week and loving it. I've worked 90 hours a week. I never loved it. It's pretty brutal. My wife still talks about it. I would go to work in the morning, work all night, work all day, come home, sleep for 8 hours, and go back to work. Basically do 40-hour shifts. I've done that. I've done that in 2 different companies. Not sustained, usually only for a week or 2 in advance of a development. But here's the problem. Management counts on heroic overtime, and they shouldn't. Yes?
Do you think a lot of that comes from, hey, we just see these developers as like pretty expendable, like they're here to get the job done for us, versus like, I don't know, I was just like, I don't know if that's an actual connection, but I just.
It's an interesting set of things. And let me roll back. When I graduated, so we're back in the 70s, there was a point of pride among software developers that we were salaried employees, not hourly employees, because it meant we were in the professional ranks. We were equivalent to managers, to accountants, to professional individuals within organizational settings. And so working overtime, if you worked overtime, just like a manager or an accountant or sales rep or anyone else, well, it's not sales reps because they're always on what you call it, commission thing. But it was sort of a point of pride, and so you had this, yes, I'm a salaried employee. Trust me, if the standard at that time had been for developers get paid by the hour in a regular full-time jobs, software developers, there would be a lot less overtime. Because it'd be expensive. But that sort of got baked into the industry, and then you had the rise of software startups in the 80s. And you had the first tech boom, which was in the 80s with personal computers, complete with the tech crash in 88, 89, which most people outside the industry don't recognize because most of the companies weren't publicly traded. They were all private companies. But I got caught in that. I went through bankruptcy and foreclosure, was unemployed or underemployed for about a year and a half. And then we had the second tech crash after the dot-com boom. And frankly, I think we're headed for a third tech crash. We have far too many unicorns out there, far too many companies with bloated valuations that really can't be sustained by any financial model. Yes?
I'm just wondering what you think that tech crash is going to look like.
I think what it'll look like is that it's still, there's a lot of money chasing after it, which is what happens each time. As long as there's money chasing after it, the balloon will continue to inflate. What it will look like is that you will have, how many of you have read Bad Blood or seen The Inventor, which is the, I think it's on Hulu, documentary about Theranos. How many of you know about Theranos? This is a med tech startup done by Stanford dropout Elizabeth Holmes to revolutionize diagnosis based on blood. And I've read the book on it by John Carreyrou. I've seen the thing, and someone asked on Quora, was it doomed from the start? And I answered and said yes. I said, looking at what here, it was doomed from the start. There were problems right from the very beginning that were baked in, and yet they were valued at, I don't know how many billions of dollars at some point, and then collapsed in a matter of weeks. They went from being valued for like $46 billion to basically being valued to zero in a matter of weeks. And what happened, and I recommend the book or the documentary to find out just what the history was there. It's a great thing. I will also recommend, with some caution because of some of the content, how many of you are familiar with the Fire Festival? Oh yeah, a lot more of you. Have any of you watched there's 2 documentaries, one on Netflix, one somewhere else. Trust me, I started watching that, and 10 minutes in, I was saying, this is going to end so bad. I mean, all the warning symptoms were there. So once you've taken this class, you'll watch documentaries like this and you'll say, oh my gosh, this is going to end so ugly, and it always does. So your question, this is getting back to your question, how did this heroic startup? It started off as sort of a point of pride within the industry, and then management first came to expect it, and then you had the startup mania and the geek lottery because you had developers who became millionaires, occasionally billionaires. I have a friend of a friend who was in the dot-com boom in the 90s and cashed out in time and walked away with $150 million. Basically, they did a startup, sold the startup to someone else, walked away. He now owns entire city block that he bought in a small town in the Bay Area Peninsula. He lives on the block. He includes, and he rents it. He owns all the buildings, rents them all out. It includes a firehouse, so he rents the land of the fire station and so on. And he's a friend of a friend. The friend that he's a friend of lost. Basically, was also in the dot-com thing and was not in the company that got out in time and walked away with nothing. So you'll hear references to the geek lottery. Geek lottery is real, but frankly, the odds are not unlike the real lottery. It'd be a little better. I mean, Qualtrics. Doesn't someone here work for Qualtrics? Yeah, they just got bought for what, $1 billion? $8 billion?
I think it was 10, but
10 billion, yeah. You know, it's a startup, and frankly, there are unicorns running around here in Utah. Startups who have high valuations. Some are successful, some have great products, some don't. And the thing that you'll see if you read the book Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, or watch the documentary, The Inventor, about Theranos, is you will see how money will get poured in even when you don't really have evidence that what they're trying to do works, which is a lot of what happened in the dot-com boom in the late 90s. Quality of time, oh yes.
on the previous slide, just more of a comment than really a question. I've noticed sorry, more of a comment. I've noticed that with school, especially universities, we have the problem of having multiple managers that each of them, from their perspective, are not assigning us overtime.
Yeah.
But cumulatively, it's at the expense of our personal lives, and yeah, I'm feeling the burnout. Like, so I don't really have any suggestions, but I noticed that.
It is hard. I mean, my rule of thumb was you should never take more than 3 classes as a computer science major. Never take more than 3 classes that require coding. Just 2 classes, you can get away with it. For exactly that reason. Because you're right. They will say, oh, well, you can do this, and it's not that much, but if you're a student taking 15 to 18 credit hours, it can absolutely kill you. I actually went through burnout, lost my scholarship, dropped out for a semester, and then went back and finished my degree, so I know exactly what that's like. And it is a very real issue, and I have, you know, all I can do is that I tend to recommend to people, don't overburden yourself. Be realistic in the level of classes you take, and if it takes you an extra semester, it takes you an extra semester. And it taking me almost an extra year, pretty much, not quite, but really about an extra 1.5 semesters, an extra semester in a term, you know. Quality of time permits. Oh, quality. We're going to talk a lot about quality. But the simple truth is that this is as I already said, the redheaded stepchild of IT. Companies think they can get by with minimal quality. Brooks, as you noted, said that you're going to spend half your time on a project doing testing, basically quality assurance, whether or not you plan for that. And this is why you see so many projects that reach that, oh, we're 80, 90% done, and then drag on for months. What they're doing is they're actually doing the quality assurance they should have been doing up front. And as per one of the readings today, they have often deferred all the hard problems to the last. And now they're in a real slough of despair. Any of you seen shortcuts on quality in places that you've worked and consequences thereof? Parkinson's Law, you've all heard, work expands to fill the time allotted. This was actually, DeMarco Lister say this was actually a satirical point. But you have managers who say, well, if we don't assign the developers enough work, they're just going to sit around and have fun and waste time. No, you usually have more to do than if you have time left over, it's kind of like, okay, I can either go do stuff or I can ask for more tasks. But often you will have, there is a mindset among some managers that unless we just keep the pressure cranked, we're not going to get their best effort out of them. What they do is they burn out or drive away programmers. Plus, there's a lot of stuff that's not relevant. At the startups I did, I found that my best programming time was pretty much 6 p.m. to about 1 a.m. because no one was bothering me. No meetings, no phone calls, very few emails. Just put on my headphones and code, get into the zone, and do it until I started falling asleep and making mistakes. And then wrap up for the night, or on some of those real crunch weeks, would simply sleep at my desk and start the next morning. Any thoughts? Any comments? And now we get to the early chill chapter. This actually echoes Brooks' Silver Bullet chapter. Management is always looking for the magic solution. Something that's going to let us do cutting edge, useful software in half the time with half the people, and the quality is going to be great. And it never happens. It never happens. Instead, you get projects that are late, you get people who burn out, you get the myth that, oh, if we just use X methodology, oh, if we just use this. My daughter Crystal is interviewing for a job that uses DevOps, and she hasn't done DevOps at her current job, and I said, well, here's what you need to do when you talk to the manager. This manager, she actually had the engineering lead wanted to hire her, and the manager stepped in and said, she doesn't have DevOps experience. I need to double check this. And I said, the thing to say is, are you looking at DevOps as a silver bullet? How well does your management organization work? What are the things that I basically gave her a number of things she could ask to set the manager back on his skills. I'm very good at that. But the point is, I've heard this for 45 years. Oh, we're going to have program generators. The first program generator I saw ads for was a program called, modestly, the last one. Meaning the last software you'll ever need to buy. Because this was going to generate all your software for you. It was a technical and commercial flop. But those same silver bullets have been pushed for years. It's like low code, no code. There's nothing new about that. We called it fourth generation languages back in the 90s. And yeah, there are some simple apps and things that people could do who weren't necessarily technical. But we're back to armor. As soon as you want to do something that has value, you enter into the realms of ignorance. And all these silver bullets don't help you there. You have to do the creative, inventive work to figure out if there is a solution, to find out what you don't know. What you don't know, you don't know. Any questions, observations, anything like that? You're learning the clever thing, if you don't ask questions, then you get through faster. Okay, I'll leave it to you to decide what I'm going to be real honest here. If you're doing the reading, to a certain extent, I don't care. But I do have some great stories for you. Okay, let's talk about Webster number 2. Okay, the thermocline of truth. Back during the tech crash, 88, 89, I was hired in the fall of 88 as a contract developer at Apple. And I'll have other stories about what I did there. Well, at the end of it, they offered me a full-time position. I said, no, I'll pass. And part of the reason is what I had observed at Apple at that time was that you had this upper layer of management, and then you had this deep area, and look at the diagram up here as I'm talking about this, where all the developers and team leaders were, and stuff was sort of drifting down from management, but all the information about what was really the problem wasn't getting up to management from the lower things. Then once I started doing consulting several years later and going into organizations to assess and review troubled projects, I found the same problem. What I quickly discovered is that I could go interview, and I've said this before, I could go interview like 10 engineers who are down in trenches. And doing that within a day or two, I could tell you what all the problems were. And management was clueless. They would pay me big bucks to tell them things that they could find out with a few hours of walking around and asking people. This is such a chronic problem because what you have is this resistance to transmit bad news uphill. And I said all this and didn't define what a thermal. How many of you have ever gone swimming in a lake? Okay, you know what it's like when like the first foot of water is really warm and then below that it's like ice cold? That's a thermocline. You have the same thing in the ocean. You have this sharp change of temperature. And it can actually, in the ocean, you actually have all sorts of plankton that cannot rise above the thermocline. They're trapped below. They can't penetrate that thermal barrier. I know all this because I took an oceanography class in high school. And we actually dropped temperature probes over the side of the, we rented a boat and went out to sea and had a temperature probe, and we're actually measuring the thermocline at various points on the coast off San Diego. And then the really funny part there was Dr. Thompson, teacher who was visiting professor who came and taught this every summer because it meant a free summer in San Diego. He had borrowed the device for the thermocline from San Diego State University and the rope broke. He looked very stricken because he was going to have to go back and tell them he lost their thermograph. But that's not here or there. The point is that information, accurate information, is hard to get up the chains of management. My favorite story here, I got sucked into Y2K remediation at Fannie Mae in the late 90s. And the person who was actually, Carol Teasley was the person actually in charge of Y2K for Fannie Mae. She's the vice president of Fannie Mae, and she dragged me into it. It's a whole other story. It's how I ended up testifying before Congress, by the way. But their goal was to have all the remediation, all the modifications done for the year 2000 problem done by the end of 1998. And there were, I don't know, 12 to 18 divisions within Fannie Mae, and she had weekly meetings. And they had charts where it was red, yellow, green, as to how well they were doing. And every week it was all green and yellow, green and yellow, green and yellow. And then, first week of December, that magical 3-week point, she had the meeting and all these reports suddenly changed to yellow and red. And she looked around the room and she said, "So tell me what you know now that you didn't know a week ago." Well, what happened is when you get close to that deadline, this is why you have the 3-week effect, it becomes harder and harder to hide how bad things actually are, and it finally moves up to the top. Because you're reaching a point where you're like 3 weeks away from saying, well, we really can't go live. Yes?
Seeing this from the developer's perspective, if my manager doesn't understand the process of development, and if I start explaining what's really going on and they just see it as a stream of jargon straight out of Star Trek, like I can try to communicate what's actually going on and it'll just go right over their head. So is this something that developers can also help with, or is it mostly a manager responsibility to
Well,
avoid this?
Here's the issue, and your example is a good one. Remember I said that management tends to see software developers as unreliable wizards. We're back to the point of often upper management will see a discussion like that as, oh, they're just trying to excuse why they're not done. They're really just goofing off, or they're lazy, or they don't know what they're doing. And they won't accept, they won't give credit to what you're trying to say. One of the things I discovered when I started doing expert witness work 22 years ago, because I was very technical and I was good at explaining things and so on, what I quickly discovered was that I could be as technically sound and accurate, and it wouldn't mean a thing if the trier of fact, be that a judge or a jury, did not understand the significance of what I was saying. And so what I have had to learn to do as an expert witness is to come up with the right analogies. And that's pretty much what you'll end up doing if you have non-technical management. You'll have to figure out analogies that are a sufficiently accurate reflection of the problem that you face, that they can understand. And you can say, look, it's like this and this and this, and if we don't do this, this is going to happen. And with the analogy, they'll say, oh, well, yeah, I can see that. I use lots of different analogies. I use construction all the time. There's so many analogies between software development and construction, even though there's so many differences, because people understand construction. Everyone watches the Home and Garden Network. Everyone understands home remodeling and home construction. Everyone watches Joanne and Chip. I mean, it's just, it's people have this almost, Americans at least, have almost this instinctive understanding of all the realities and pitfalls of home modification and home construction. Either they've been through it, they know someone who's been through it, they've watched Fixer Upper for 10 years or whatever. And so I tend to use a lot of those analogies because people, juries are like, yeah, I understand that. They don't care about bits and bytes. They don't care about, ON versus ON squared. But they understand. Oh, the house was rewired for 240. So none of the appliances work. We have to rip it out and change all this and change the outlets. And oh yeah, I understand that. So this is an issue. Now here's the final problem, and I've had disagreements. In fact, if you read this and looked through my points, Jerry Weinberg actually showed up to disagree with me, and I disagreed back with him. He's one of the giants. He's passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago. Anything by Jerry Weinberg is worth reading. And Psychology of Computer Programming, which he published 4 years before Mythical Man Month, points out you can't create a baby in 1 month with 9 women. He literally uses that analogy. So he was one of the pioneers, one of the giants. I would have you read Psychology of Computer Programming, except it's a long book, and the technology, a lot of technical references are even more out of date, but the truisms are all still there. Anyway, Jerry and I disagreed on this. It's often a single person who's the problem, who refuses to pass stuff up. I've seen that personally in projects I've reviewed. And upper management doesn't like bad news. There's a cliche, upper management says, I don't want to hear about problems, I don't want to hear about solutions. Like, no, you really do have to hear about the problems, because we can't solve this. We literally will not get this done on time. Unless, of course, you have features. Of course, management never wants to cut features. We talked about all this. How do you do it? Management needs to reward honesty, and management doesn't always reward honesty. That's a simple problem. Management just wants to ship. They want to get it out in the market. They want to make the numbers. Sometimes this is disastrous. But it's the incentives there. Yes.
So the combination of managers rewarding honesty and trying to understand, and the developers trying to speak in a way that can be understood. It's a combination of those that solves the problem.
Yep. But sometimes you can't get across. I think I already told you, that late in the development of pages, but before we shipped, our CEO came and said, "Can we put in rotating headlines?" And I just buried my face in my hands. I said, "Larry, no, we can't." I said, "Why not? Other applications have it." I said, "Larry, if you wanted rotating headlines, you had to have defined that as a feature like a year and a half ago and put in the architecture for it." I said, "We don't have the architecture. We can't do a quick and dirty fix." Yes?
My thought on that is, like the management thing, is if you're unable to communicate with your manager is unable to understand you, and you aren't like able to fix that problem, like you need to start looking for another job. Because like that's such an important part of your entire life that like if you can't communicate, either if it's your fault or their fault or a mix, right? It's like that's for me, that's like it. I'm not gonna work with somebody that can't understand me, right? So.
That can't understand you or is not willing to trust.
Yeah.
And that's really the issue. Loyalty is a two-way street. And I have great respect for Larry. I think he was a great CEO. He and I butted heads a number of times. But in the end, Larry trusted my technical assessment. Didn't always like what I had to say, but he trusted my assessment. And on the other hand, I trusted him to, run the company and do the things that they needed to do. Any other questions on thermocline? Yes?
Do you think some of this is also like a problem with the developers being super optimistic and like thinking that things are going to be done faster?
Well, that's a whole other problem. The thermocline of truth is when you're trying to get what things are really there. Developers being optimistic often causes a scheduling problem in the first place. And that's why you have Brooks talk about you need to be willing to give an honest estimate. You need to be brave in saying this is how long it's going to take, or in saying we don't know how long it's going to take. We need to get a certain ways into the project and then assess where things are, because it is. I mean, I've caused problems. I caused problems in pages because I was even with my initial rejected schedule was over optimistic. Because I was making assumptions. This was the largest development team where I was responsible for the architecture and so on. And I sort of mentally divided myself in 8 and did not account for the issues in trying to coordinate development among the team members and figure out the problems. There were problems that cropped up that we just didn't foresee. Footnotes are hideous in the document processing system. They really are. If you stop and think about a live thing where you're typing in and it's certain, I mean, Microsoft Word still has bugs with footnotes. We'll suddenly push them to another page, then won't bring them back when you edit. It is one of the more difficult problems in a live interactive document processing system. Plus, the letters have to appear on the screen fast enough. There can't be more than a fraction of a second delay, or people literally can't type. They get this mental, you hit a key and if it takes too long for the letter to show up, you start hitting the key again. So, yeah, the optimism can be an issue, but it's the thermocline is more when management doesn't want to hear your pessimism. Any other questions or comments on this? Conways Law. I was brought in, and I think I've made at least a passing reference to this, brought into a Fortune 50 corporation that had a enterprise-wide re-engineering project. They brought in 2 big-name consulting firms. They were going to replace all their legacy systems with this new end-to-end system. The project had been bid at 2 years and $180 million. I had previously consulted at this corporation, which is why they brought me in. When they brought me in, it had been going for 4 years. They had spent $500 million, and they had 0 code in production. So after 4 years and $500 million, they had nothing working. And they brought me in to review what they needed to do to get into production. And of course, me being me, one of the first things I asked is, who's the chief architect? Well, there wasn't one. Well, what's the architecture look like? Well, we don't know. So I started diving in because this was divided, this end-to-end system was divided up among different divisions of the company. Each was its own little separate fiefdom with different people in charge. And this is an old Windows screensaver. This is pretty much what the architecture looked like. It was incredibly, I mean, for $500 million, this is incredibly convoluted architecture. The stuff going all over the place, nothing consistent, nothing coherent. And so Conways Law is that an organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. This was writ large. This was so divided up between different divisions of the company and then different teams within each division. And this insane architecture was a consequence of that. Because everyone was working on their little piece and they had sort of some interfaces here and there, and there was no chief architect. There was no overriding architecture. There weren't guiding principles. Yes?
I guess I just had a question kind of about that. When you go into a situation like that, like what do you suggest to fix that problem when it's already just like the architecture is not really there and so disorganized?
I ended up, I had a team of 3 other people, and we spent 3 months going through and just figuring out each of these different components, where they're at, and so on. The report that I issued was about a 45-page report with suggestions all the way through as to what needed to be done. Starting with they had no chief architect and they had no head of QA. So that's the other problem, is they had all these chunks and there was no unified effort for quality control. They would just sort of test on an ad hoc basis. Let me tell you what happened. We had this, I gave the presentation of our findings after 3 months. We had the executive vice president who was over this whole project. He reported to the CIO, so he was like, 2 steps removed from the CEO. And then we had the top level managers, and then we had the mid-level managers, and some of the team leaders. I don't think we actually had any developers there because most of the developers were frankly with these 2 big name consulting corporations. And I start presenting our findings. And I'm looking around the room and I notice there are 3 types of reactions I'm seeing. I'm seeing anger on the face of the executive vice president and some of the top level managers. I'm seeing stark horror on the faces of a number of the other managers who are for the first time realizing just what in bad shape this project is. And then there's a small contingent of people who are nodding their head. Who are the ones who couldn't get above the thermocline of truth. Who've been trying to say all along, this is really, really in bad shape. The executive vice president got up and walked out halfway through my, well, first he tried to grill me and trip me up. Tried to make me look, dumb. And I remember standing here thinking, buddy, I have been cross-examined by top attorneys in court. You can't lay a finger on me. And he didn't. And he finally walked out. What I found out later, he walked out to try and track down every copy of my report to destroy it. Which was futile, because of course I had it on my laptop. And I was working for OSG, and Tony Gibson president of OMG, came and said, "Do you have a copy of your report and your slide presentation?" Of course I do. So he took them and gave them directly to the CEO of that corporation. And the executive vice president, the CIO were both fired. Because they had spent 4 years and $500 million and been telling the CEO that everything was great and they were on the verge of going live. My understanding is they spent another couple of years and a few $100 million more and got a tiny fraction of what they'd done in production. So it was a waste of almost $1 billion. Anyway, yes?
I'm just curious, in those sorts of situations, what do your recommendations typically look like? Like, do you sometimes just say burn it all down and start over?
Sometimes yes. Sometimes things are so bad. And I think it's in your readings. I think I've got this, was the septic code. It's one of the readings. You can have situations that are so bad that you really do have to just start over. And with a lot of the failed projects that I review as an expert witness, that's often what happens. They fire the original developer and they bring someone else in, and you know, they've got analysis and so on, but usually they throw the whole source code away and just start from scratch, and it's a lot faster. The worst software disaster along those lines I know of was in England. It was this project to implement software across their welfare system, across all of the United Kingdom. It went on for years, and it finally died. They had spent £10 billion, $16 billion, and it was determined there was no source code in the whole effort that was worth saving. Stuff like this happens all the time. Air Force has like 130 different accounting systems, and they started a project to go to a single accounting system because they literally can never balance their books because all their expenditures are across all these accounting systems. They spent $1 billion and finally pulled the plug. And incidentally, one of the core problems was the thorough line of truth. That is, mid-level managers kept trying to raise the issue of there are serious problems here, and upper management did not want to hear it. Okay, do not defer the difficult. It is so tempting. It's so easy to gin up a prototype. There are such great tools out there. It's like, yeah, we've got this, we've got the prototype, we've got the menus, we've got everything else. And it's very easy to get a particular aspect or component to the 60, 70, 80% level. And then it's like, yeah, you know, there's some hard stuff there, but you know, we'll figure it out later. What happens is you get all the easy stuff done, and then you're at that last thing, and for each of these sections you have one or more hard problems. And you suddenly discover they are really hard problems. The analogy I like to use is you have a bowl that's filled with flour and walnuts. And you dump it into a sifter, and you sift it through, and all the flour goes through, and the walnuts just rattle around. Basically, you have to take the walnuts and pound them to dust to get them through the sieve. So many projects fail on this issue. They defer the hard problems, and they find out, we're back to armor, they find out things they didn't know, and they find out they don't have solutions for the things they didn't know. Or they have gone down with this 80% solution in the different subsystems. They get to the hard problems at the end of those, the other 10 to 20%, and discover that they have mutually incompatible. In other words, we can solve this over here, or we can solve this over here, but we can't solve them both at the same time because of design decisions. So you have to tackle the hardest problems first. Something that I'm so grateful I did at Pages The idea of Pages was a desktop publishing system where you could switch a design model. And it would change the whole layout and flow. It would use different graphical rules and typesetting rules for the document. And you didn't have to do anything. You just say, okay, I want to go from this design model to this design model. And it could relay out the whole document. And Vic Spindler, who's a graphic designer, one of the 2 co-founders of Pages, had some example design models. So I was doing, this is early days, this is when I'm doing very early architecture, prototyping, trying to figure out what we're going to do. And I'm looking at these, and they're somewhat different, but not terribly different. I went back to Vic and said, Vic, I need you to create for me the most weird and difficult design model that we are likely to want to do. And so he did so. He came up with a design model called April, named after April Bragman, a famous avant-garde graphic designer, which had things like circular headlines, so the text had to flow around, the circular headline. It wasn't a rectangle in the flow of text. It was that. Anyway, a lot of strange stuff. April was my nightmare, because I'm trying to do the architecture and I get stuff and say, yeah, we can do this, and then I look at April and say, oh my gosh, we've got to do this, we've got to be able to do this. It was one of the best things because what it did is it broadened the scope of the architecture. Because I had to do all the normal ones, and then here was April way off in the corner. And so anything I did architecturally had to be big enough and flexible enough to encompass all of these design models. And that turned out to be of great benefit because we would come up with multiple design models. Like, yeah, we can do that. We do April, we can do anything. So you have to take the time. This is actually a problem that you often have with agile or tightly iterative development efforts, which is if you don't spend enough time about thinking about the scope of your design, your solution space ahead of time, you can narrow in on the easy solutions, and then when you try to broaden out, you find that you've locked yourself into something. You've got to break the architecture and go back to something that's wider. Okay, any questions on this? So let's do the requirements. Talk isn't terribly long, and then we'll be done. Okay. R-Truth requirements. I've already shown this one. This is one of my favorite XKCDs. It's kind of hard. Oh, that's big. This gets back to the unreliable wizard. It's hard to explain the difference between something that's easy and something that's hard. And I mean, how many of you have done this? Someone says, "Hey, can you add this feature?" It's like, "Oh yeah, look, you do like 5 minutes. It's running." You say, "Can you add this?" It's like, "No." I mean, this is me with Larry saying, "Can we rotate headlines?" No, Larry, you can't. It would take some significant restructuring our entire architecture to put rotating headlines in there. That was never envisioned. So, you're going to create, as a team, a requirements document. I want it defining what you want to present for your initial demo and then for the final demo. Now, I'll make this clear again. I'm not going to look at your source code. I'm not going to even grade you on what your demo does. Though I want your demo to do something. We had pretty simple demos in the past. Mostly because people decided to tackle stuff that they shouldn't have tried to tackle. But figure out what you want to demo for your two sets. Define the output. What's going to be on the screen. And work backwards from there to figure out what you're going to have working inside. This should be your baseline. Now, why are requirements are always such a problem in software for a number of reasons. First, and Robert Glass talks about this. You'll read this in Facts and Fallacies. I believe I had this in my opening lecture. They're done by the wrong people at the wrong time. Requirements are done by management at the start of the project, and management often doesn't know what's possible, and they're done before you really know what you're going to build. The problem is that you need to not be optimistic, as per the optimistic comment. You need to scale back the scope of what you're doing. Management doesn't want to hear that, because what drives sales? You're doing something new and exciting. You're doing it better than someone else, and significantly better than someone else. You're doing something no one has ever done before. You have some clever solution, some clever user interface. And the problem is you're often biting off more than you can chew. But what you want is, you want this to be the baseline of what you're building, because it's going to be, hopefully, something you're using to communicate among each other. It's important, and I would like to see this in your requirements documents to define what you're not doing where that's relevant. This is a very useful exercise. It pages, and again, obligatory, if I've already said this. One of the things we did after we got venture funding and we brought Larry, our CEO, on board, he did a very wise thing. He said, I want a spreadsheet with every possible feature that can go into a document processing, or a document, word processing, desktop publishing system. We built this spreadsheet with like 600 plus features. And then, as a senior team, we sat down for every feature. We said, we want this in version 1.0. Or, we would like this eventually, but it's not going to go into version 1.0. Or, this is never going to be in Pages. So we defined all the things that we weren't going to try and do, and I'm pretty sure rotating headlines were in that third group. Because we never considered those. Anyway, I'm sorry. So, in your, I'm not expecting, I don't want big requirements documents. You're welcome to elaborate it, but focus on what's essential. Here is what we're going to demonstrate in the 2 demos. Here's what we're not going to do. And then use this to help communicate with each other, because I see teams that struggle in this class because of lack of communication among the team members as to what they should or should not be doing, should or should not be building. And you have team members that will spend time on features that are not in the requirements, or that are not sufficiently ruled out in the requirements. As always, I strongly encourage you to go, you can easily go to the wikis for other semesters. Feel free to steal their requirement documents, to look for formats that you like, to look for language that you like. That's some of the best reuses in deliverables. You don't have to kind of, this is not a measure of your creativity in coming up with a requirements document from scratch. This is, you've got a week to come up with your initial draft, your requirements document. I'd recommend your podcast for this week that you watch Dr. Knutson's podcast on software requirements. And again, you can count up to 2 hours of reading in, or podcast in this case, towards your billable hours. And you should actually be updating this document through the semester, because you should be probably dropping features as you go along. Now, what are the problems in requirements? Well, you write them before you know what you want to build, and you write them before you know if you can build it. We've already talked about the wrong people writing them. Now, let's talk, and this goes outside of what you're doing for your class, but generally with requirements in the real world. Have any of you ever had the experience of helping to implement a feature for your customer, how you want to define your customer, and you're doing what they asked, and you show it and they say, no, that's not what I want. Yeah, so yeah. One of the things we discovered at Page is, one of the important truths is that beta users or beta testers are not end users. Things that our beta testers love, our end users said, no, we don't want this. And we had to scramble to add some features and do some things that we had ignored for 3.5 years. It's like, oh, they really, really want word perfect key bindings. That was never something we considered. We actually put in Emacs key bindings as well. Another core problem with requirements is the requirements explosion happens. You're going to be defining general requirements. What will happen in a real world setting, and again, I don't know how many of you have experienced this, is that when you start to get into design and implementation, you get like this 50 to 1, 100 to 1 explosion. You know, the requirement is it will do this, this, and this. But suddenly, when you move into design and implementation, it's like, well, that requires this, and this, and this, and this. You have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do that. You can have scope creep. How many have had the experience of you're bringing a system towards where you want to ship and management, or someone comes in and says, oh, by the way, can you add these features as well? Have you had that experience? Yeah. You don't want to tell a story, you don't got to. Yes?
Well, luckily, it was like within the first week, but it was still like this very last minute project where they said, okay, we're going to give you 3 weeks to get this whole thing done. And then 1 week in, they're like, actually, we want to change it from just doing like this like sound analysis to like wind analysis too. And you're just not happy.
Yeah. You'll find this happens a lot. Yes?
I actually have seen this quite a few times in classes here, because it's like the class has just been reworked, or it's a new class or something like that. And so all of the project requirements are vastly underspecified until the professor figures that out, you know, like a few days before it's due, adds some specifications, and then you have to like refactor your code.
That won't happen. Because you're doing the requirements yourselves, and I don't really care how much you cut down the requirements. In fact, I advise you to cut down. Yes?
I was wondering about the balance between like specific requirements and like too specific creeping up into the design implementation aspect, if that makes any sense.
Give me an example.
Like specifying, okay, we're going to have this user interface that allows the user to do X, Y, and Q. But then do we want to specify, okay, well, Q, we want to make sure that it allows the user to, that like they're getting something from like the database and that it's fast, like at this speed or something. Like, I don't know, does that make any sense? Maybe I'm just misunderstanding how like requirements, like that balance.
Well, it's part of it. I mean, part of it is I'm not saying explosion is a bad thing. I'm saying explosion is often a necessary thing. So if you say, yeah, we're going to do Q, and you say that at the high level, the initial level, architectural level, and then you get to Q and say, well, Q actually implies that we have to have the database structured this way. We have to, maintain database consistency this way. We've got the speed coming in, and we have to respond to the feed within so many milliseconds to update this information. And so part of it is that your initial set of requirements may look relatively, oh yeah, that's not bad. And then as you start to implement each one, it's like, oh my gosh, we gotta get this done, we gotta get this done, and this has to happen, and this has to happen. And that's where you have to be willing to go back and say, okay, what can we cut as a feature in order to get this done in time? Waterfall versus agile. The waterfall with requirements, the problem is what's called analysis paralysis. You never really decide on a final set of requirements because you're always tweaking them. Sometimes you just have to say, this is what we're building, and go with that. Agile, I've already mentioned the possibility that if you have not thought through the architecture carefully, you can put limits in there and then discover as you're in implementation, oh, we made a mistake. We really have to break things. You know, we now, it's kind of like as if I had done pages and then the architecture based on the initial set of design models. And then at some point, Vic came back and said, oh, by the way, here's April Griman. I look at it and I want to weep because I have not planned for this at all. You know, that's what would have happened. It's like, oh my gosh, I've got to go back and rework so much stuff to get it here. So, what your team has to do by midnight Saturday is your initial requirements document should be available on your project wiki page. I really recommend go back and look at prior semesters. Browse through there. Literally, grab their document and just, you know, use their format but change the words, you know what I mean. Look at the examples because you'll get a sense of what I'm looking for. And to a certain extent, you know, I will look these, I will critique them if I consider them to be really lightweight. But the simple truth is, you know, outside of something that's just really bad, you're going to get full credit for it anyway. This is what you're going to have to live with. So this has to be a document that can serve your team. Your next status report should be up there on the wiki page. And individually, podcast 2 is due by midnight on Saturday. By start of next class, read, and I actually think the deadline's for midnight on Monday, but whatever. Read Peopleware 1 Part 2, Webster 3. Count up to 2 hours of reading in their podcast is billable. And we'll talk about project estimation scheduling. What you'll do next week is create a PERT chart and a Gantt chart for your project. With insufficient time and too little information, but hey, that's what they do in the real world as well. Any other questions before we go? I'll try to get this video up there sooner rather than later. The slides are already up on the website. If not, have a great week. And see you next